The planets Jupiter and Neptune will be forming a conjunction in their shared sign of rulership, Pisces, on April 12th, 2022. And when we look at the high vibrational qualities of each of these two planets individually, and at the bottom of the screen, how they combine when they're operating high vibrationally, it's easy to see why so many astrologers are extremely excited about this transit, because it does have so much potential. But the reality, unfortunately, is that we are living in a world that is still primarily operating from a lower vibrational energy. And so, of course, that's also going to influence the implications of how these two planets act in their cycle. So unfortunately, a lot of the lower vibrational qualities of these planets, both individually and in their combined meanings and symbolisms, are going to be what we actually see as we work through the historical evidence of how this cycle seems to operate through time. So first of all, before we dive completely into it, what do we mean when we talk about the Jupiter Neptune cycle to begin with? So just like a new moon, where the sun and moon form a conjunction, any two planetary objects can come together and seed their mutual intentions that they want to fulfill over their cyclical period. So for example, the sun and the moon has a cycle of 28 days. So they can come into their new moon phase, and together they'll sort of germinate a seed. And then through the course of that 28-day period where the moon pulls ahead of the sun and then comes back around to a new moon again 28 days later, they will fulfill whatever was germinated. So for Jupiter and Neptune, they start a new cycle every 13 years. So they form a conjunction every 13 years in any sign. However, 2022 is also the first time since 1856 that the two planets have come together in their shared sign of rulership, which is Pisces. So one of the things that we're going to be doing first in this video is looking back at the year 1856, and I think you'll be surprised at the patterns that correlate with our 2022 conjunction. So in 1856, when Jupiter and Neptune were conjunct in Pisces, Louis Pasteur was at university, and this would be the man who would really make a lot of innovations in vaccine technology that would lead to their more widespread use. Vaccines did exist prior to Pasteur, but he did kind of set things in motion more for them to become widely used. In 2022, we also see something called mRNA technology. Of course, it's been around for 30 plus years, but in the last 2 years, it has been inoculated globally. And so we're still waiting the long-term results of this. So I think that we can see here, for example, that this Jupiter-Neptune conjunction in Pisces is sort of planting the seed for what will come. It was planting the seed in 1856 for vaccines to become more widely used. And in 2022, it's planting the seed for who knows, but something related to mRNA technology is likely to come more to light in the following decades. We also see, now Big Pharma is going to come up a lot in this video, but the pharmaceutical industry itself, so pharmaceutical medications such as aspirin was the first or one of the first pharmaceutical medicines to be created. That all happened in 1856. Some of the biggest names like Eli Lilly, Squibb, and Pfizer, they all had their starts here in the mid-1800s. And in 2022, what we see at this point, when the Jupiter-Neptune cycle in Pisces has gone full circle, we're back in Pisces again, Big Pharma has become big business. And a lot of the initial pharmaceutical tycoons like Lilly and Squibb and Pfizer that I talked about, they knew that it would. And a lot of those early people also had connections to military because there is, there's an understanding that when war is happening, there's going to be a greater need for medicine and for medical services and medical products. So there is profit to be made in many ways when we are at war. And a lot of people want to cash in on that, including Big Pharma, and that connection between those two will come up again later when we're talking about Theranos. But yeah, we'll talk a lot as well about 2022 being a year of big consequences for these pharmaceutical companies. So also in 1856, germ theory. So this connects to Louis Pasteur. Obviously, he was utilizing germ theory, but it was being utilized in a lot of ways to help combat spread of pathogens. And disease being spread was becoming a bigger issue in the mid-1800s because more people were living in urban areas. So other lifestyle factors as well were contributing to these changes. But there was also at the time a big boost of an understanding of what pathogens are and how they operate and how to deal with them. And how to protect people from them. So in 2022, what do we see along these same lines? The issue of bioresearch itself. The study of pathogens has come under scrutiny, so I don't think I have to explain that too much to you, of course, in light of the pandemic that we've just experienced, but also because there are bioresearch facilities in Ukraine. That's what has been said by a member of the State Department to Congress. But this has become an issue because people are wondering, what are the proper safety measures? What are the ethical ways to approach this type of research? So that, I think, will be a big question for us collectively to discover as we begin this new Jupiter-Neptune cycle. And then also in 1856, the Crimean War had just ended. Now, this war only lasted 2 years, but it had huge consequences because it really upset the balance of power in Europe, and it set the stage for World War I. So the very first World War, it wasn't that World War I, but it set the stage for it. And I think likewise, we can see this relating to a war that is started here in 2022, just as the Jupiter-Neptune conjunction is perfecting. Hopefully, this war will even be much more short-lived than the Crimean War. But already, 2 months into it, we can see that this war is also tremendously upsetting the balance of world powers in Europe, but also globally. And that sort of resettling of alliances and stabilizing and destabilizing of world powers is really what led up to World War I. So we're going to see what the consequences of this resetting of the balance means as well as we go forward from the current Jupiter-Neptune conjunction in 2022. All right, like I said, there are going to be lots of references to Big Pharma here, and we cannot talk about Big Pharma unless we talk about the astrological correlations of Jupiter-Neptune to Purdue Pharma. Purdue Pharma is the company that created OxyContin, which is largely credited with a significant increase in the opioid crisis. If there's a star athlete on the opioid crisis team, it would be OxyContin. But let's look over the timeline here, because in 1984, Jupiter and Neptune were conjunct at 0 degrees Capricorn. I always think that the 0 degree of any sign is really important if you have a major transit there, because it's the very first breath into any new sign. But in any case, Purdue Pharma begins to market a drug called MS-Contin, which was a precursor to OxyContin in that year. And that quickly became a highly addictive and lucrative drug with 2,000% markups when sold on the street. So it was one of the most expensive street drugs, basically. Or, lucrative, because it could be marked up to such an intense degree. And then in 1996, OxyContin is released to the market along with a marketing campaign aimed at deceiving medical professionals and the public to believe that less than 1% of users of OxyContin would become addicted due to its time-release coating. Despite the fact that they had no credible sources, no credible research to support this, they were extremely effective at marketing this idea and making it believable. It's hard to believe, but that's one of the important things that we need to point out about Jupiter and Neptune is that it can delude us. So when if you have Jupiter, Neptune, in this current 2022 transit aspecting any of your natal planets or angles or your nodal axis, there are lots of positives that can come of that, but you really have to be mindful as well to a propensity to want to believe the impossible. The idea that a drug like this could become addictive to less than 1% of users is beyond belief, and yet masses of medical professionals were led to believe that. So it wasn't until the next year, 1997, that Jupiter and Neptune formed their next conjunction, and that was at 27 degrees of Capricorn. But I think that with any transit like this, everything is happening in flux, and this is a 13-year cycle. It's kind of like when you think about an approaching new moon, people get excited about the new moon even before it arrives, or the full moon. You can feel the effects of a full moon even before it's here. So I think likewise, the effects of Jupiter-Neptune's conjunction in 1997 were already being felt when OxyContin was released onto the market with that deceptive marketing strategy. But also, of course, in 97, OxyContin's sales did increase significantly. It was a snowball effect. The snowball, picked up speed very quickly once it was on the market. And those sales increases, of course, were bolstered by both the highly addictive nature of the drug and the perceived credibility of Purdue Pharma's widespread campaign to teach the medical community of the virtues of this drug. In 2009, Jupiter and Neptune were conjunct 3 times, 3 times exact because of Jupiter going retrograde. And in 2010, the following year, the FDA approves a new formulation of OxyContin designed to deter abuse. So again, we see a correlation here between that 2009 conjunction and then that new FDA approval. Of course, in 2009, that new formulation and the approval process would probably have already been underway. And of course, we have 2022, and during this Jupiter-Neptune conjunction at 24 degrees of Pisces, Purdue Pharma is now set to settle for billions of dollars based on the harm that they have done to countless communities and individuals. So just to reinforce again some of the themes of Jupiter and Neptune, one of those themes is deceptive generosity. Jupiter is a very generous sign. It likes to do things big. It likes to make things very widespread. And Purdue Pharma did a lot of big donations to pain societies, law enforcement, lobbying efforts, especially lobbying, political lobbying, but also, let's see here, to medical societies. And this is a article talking about the need to really reevaluate the corporate influence on all of these systems. These webs of influence woven by several pharmaceutical companies involve health professionals, patient advocacy groups, medical professional societies, research universities, etc., and so on. Opioid companies built these webs as part of corporate strategies of influence that were designed to expand the opioid market from cancer patients to larger groups of patients with acute or chronic pain, to increase dosage as well as opioid use, to downplay the risks of addiction and abuse, and to characterize physicians' concerns about the addiction and abuse risks as opiophobia. So we can see that, for example, Purdue Pharma donated $18.7 million to pain groups, including to the American Pain Society, which is now bankrupt because of its connections to Purdue Pharma, and the American Pain Foundation, which was forced to shut down for the same reasons. The largest recipient of Purdue Pharma's donations by far was FHRMA, which is a powerful lobbying group. You can see here, this is a partisan breakdown here. This little inset on the left is from statnews.com of the pharmaceutical industry's contributions in 2020 alone. So that shows you the power of an organization like FHRMA to influence big policy decisions that will benefit big pharma. So it is no surprise that Purdue Pharma, shoveled loads of money into this lobbying group. Law enforcement agencies also received a lot of money from Purdue Pharma, and it says here that Purdue Pharma's website trumpets its support of the National Association of Drug Diversion Investigators as part of a 20-year effort to stem prescription opioid abuse. Well, clearly this company did not care about stemming opioid abuse because they were making a buttload of money off of it. And we can see also that other professional medical societies were equally targeted with donations, seeking to influence them for Purdue Pharma's benefit. The AMA and its foundation received more than $3 million, both to promote painkillers and to fight addiction to them. Isn't that ironic? The AMA denies that the funding affected its lobbying or policies. That is hard to believe, but as far as I know, the American Medical Association has had zero repercussions for its involvement with Purdue Pharma. So if we look at, again, some of the more nefarious Jupiter-Neptune associations here, generosity with ulterior motives, widespread addiction, big believable lies, and basically a plague of corruption. Because unfortunately, it wasn't just Purdue Pharma that was influenced by greed, but also doctors were making a lot of money off of prescribing these medications. Law enforcement officials were being bribed to look the other way. All right, now let's look at how technology meets the medical field and how Elizabeth Holmes made also a shit ton of money spreading lots of lies about her capabilities at taking just a few drops of blood from a finger prick and being able to form a plethora of lab tests based on those few drops of blood. She was successfully able to convince a great number of investors that she was capable of doing this. And in January 2022, she was found guilty of wire fraud and conspiracy to commit fraud against investors. She denied all charges and is currently out on a $500,000 bail while she awaits sentencing, which is due to take place in September 2022. She was also charged with deception of patients who were involved in clinical trials, and I don't know if I am shocked or not shocked, but she was not found guilty on those charges because apparently we care more about investors losing money than we do on the impact of these people who are given incorrect lab results that clearly affected their health in a number of ways. So in terms of Jupiter-Neptune correlations, of course, she's being, her sentencing is happening as the current 2022 Jupiter-Neptune conjunction is taking place. But if we look at her natal chart, we also see that she has a pretty close Jupiter-Neptune conjunction. In fact, she was about to turn 13 years old when the 1997 conjunction of Jupiter and Neptune took place at 29 degrees of Capricorn. And as we can see here, there's a quote here that I've highlighted where she mentions speaking to her long-term partner about the fact that she wanted to start a company, and it was a company that she had tried to build in high school. So this idea would have been in her head, I'm assuming, prior to high school. She does talk in interviews and things about how even in childhood she knew that she wanted to be a billionaire, which is also a big part of what fueled her desire, of course, to create this company. But I would say that 1997 conjunction probably either ignited or reinforced her plans, to become a billionaire, but also specifically with this medical technology that she wanted to bring about. Also in 1997, that 29th degree of Capricorn conjunction was also forming a transit to her 22 degree Capricorn natal Mercury. So Mercury has to do with our intellect, our thought processes, our ideas, our ability to communicate and to learn and even to research. She is an incredibly intelligent person, right? And Mercury has to do with our intelligence. This ignited her desire to use that intelligence towards the creation of something which required her to be a huge visionary. And visionary capacities are one of the more positive aspects of a Jupiter-Neptune, of the Jupiter-Neptune cycle. It allows us to believe in the impossible, right? Which is what she did. But she also led other people to believe in the impossible in a way that was ultimately criminal. Another way of saying it, as TechCrunch.com does, is that Elizabeth Holmes had a horrifying optimism. I also wanted to point out here that when we look at some of her big name investors, we'll notice as well that a lot of these people are connected to the military, which is something that we saw in 1856 when the pharmaceutical industry was being birthed. There is a correspondence here between war and an awareness of how you can profit off of medical technologies, medical advancements, etc., because war is going to create a lot of sickness and ill health that needs treatment. Okay, so we're going to switch gears here to the Tuskegee Study, which began in 1932. And the back panel on white is from history.com. That blue panel here with the timeline is from cdc.gov. But my orange words there are my own, where I put in the astrological timeline as well. So if you're not familiar with this, there were a group of medical researchers who wanted to see how syphilis would develop over time if it was untreated. Well, how do you test such a thing? Well, it's not really possible to test it ethically, and so these researchers just decided that they would test it unethically, and they apparently had no problem with doing that. So they got all of these African American men to participate in this study, men who had syphilis, and they allowed them to go untreated for decades. Even though in the mid-1940s, penicillin had become the treatment of choice for syphilis, but these men were not treated. So this is a case study for medical ethics. Even today, this is a very notorious study because of the degree of just a complete lack of morality and ethics. So if we look at the timeline here, in 1932, Jupiter and Neptune were conjunct at 8 degrees of Virgo, and that's when this study began. In the mid-1940s, 1945 specifically, penicillin had become the treatment of choice. That also correlates with a conjunction of Jupiter and Neptune at 5 degrees of Libra. In 1971, there was a conjunction of these planets in Sagittarius, and the following year, towards the beginning of the year in 1972, the first news article came out about the study. The story broke in the Associated Press, and this led ultimately to the study ending. And then we also see an astrological correlation in 1997 when Jupiter and Neptune are conjunct at 27 degrees of Capricorn, and President Clinton issues a formal presidential apology, I'm assuming to the participants and their family members. All right, so let's switch out of medical stuff for a moment, sort of. I mean, this has implications for, medical practices as well. But, wow, something that has happened early this year in the approach to this April 2022 Jupiter-Neptune conjunction in Pisces was this issue of whether or not mass formation psychosis is an actual, phenomena. It is. It is a real phenomena that has been studied and spoken about by great minds throughout time. And yet, Google decided to manipulate search results for this because they decided it wasn't a real thing. I don't know why the word narrative is cut off here, but the end of the title, it should say, due to collapsing COVID narrative. I actually highly recommend a YouTube video by a channel called After School. School is spelled S-K-O-O-L, about MassPsychosis. They actually published this video in 2021. And they quote a number of people, such as Carl Jung, Gustav Bonn, and they quote quite a bit from this guy, Joost Meerlo, who you can see on the screen now, a quote from him. Logic can be met with logic, while illogic cannot. It confuses those who think straight. The big lie and monotonously repeated nonsense have more of an emotional appeal than logic and reason. While the people are still searching for a reasonable counter-argument to the first lie, the totalitarians can assault them with another. So one of the things that we're starting to really struggle with, and that I assume will be a more pressing issue, we'll see how this all plays out over the Jupiter-Neptune cycle that is currently being seeded, but it has to do with the ability of, powerful forces such as big tech and governments to affect our thought processes through the way that they affect our contact with information. So algorithms, shadow bans, censorship, idea shaming, propaganda, anti-discourse, where we're actually discouraging discourse, and restricted media. Here's another Joost Meerlo quote. No rest, no meditation, no reflection, no conversation. The senses are continually overloaded with stimuli. Man doesn't learn to question his world anymore. The screen offers him answers already made. So if you're wondering who Meerlo was, He was a psychiatrist who specialized in the area of thought control techniques used by totalitarian and other regimes. And his best-known book is Rape of the Mind, which was published in 1856. One of the things he talked about was the way that regimes could induce waves of terror followed by moments of calm. Waves of terror where you have like peaks of fear followed by a moment of calm, and another peak of fear followed by another moment of calm, and so on. And as those waves of terror increase, the ability for the totalitarian regime to spread their propaganda and make it believed to the masses also increases, while collective morality decreases. So this was his theory based on what he had observed in the world up to that point. So basically what I'm trying to point out is the degree to which Jupiter and Neptune can, unfortunately, when they're operating from a lower vibrational energy, be used to deceive people, to deceive masses, to make people behave in ways that they wouldn't if they weren't being otherwise influenced. And one of the ways that that can take place is, unfortunately, through cult influence. Let's look here at the chart for the moment of the Heaven's Gate mass suicide. Heaven's Gate was a cult. In our next slide, we'll talk a little bit more about what this cult was about. But the leader of the group in 1997, when Jupiter was separating from its recent conjunctions to both Neptune and Uranus, influenced this group of people to all collectively commit suicide, which they were led to believe was actually for their benefit. So the central belief of the group was that followers could transform themselves into immortal extraterrestrial beings by rejecting their human nature, and they would ascend to heaven, referred to as the next level or the evolutionary level above human. There were two leaders of this group, Bonnie Nettles and Marshall Applewhite. Bonnie Nettles actually died in 1985, so she died about 12 years before this mass suicide took place. And so it was Marshall Applewhite who was left and led the group to this mass suicide. And I just wanted to show this slide as well to give us a little bit more insight into Applewhite, but also to show another aspect of Jupiter and Neptune, which has to do with a spiritual teacher or guru, or in this case, a cult leader. That's one of the influences it had. So this says, at a moment in his life when he was depressed, hearing voices in his head and having apocalyptic visions, he met Nettles. She was a nurse and mother of 4 children. She had already believed in UFOs and astrology prior to meeting Applewhite. Probably, myself and a lot of you watching also believe, well, certainly in astrology, but probably also in UFOs. So, there's a thin line, between believing in things that are bizarre and on the edge and believing in things that are actually very harmful. But let's go on. According to former friends and colleagues, she said the voices in Applewhite's head may be spirits from above telling him one day he could be a divine teacher. And basically he became that in a sense. All right, so looking at Marshall Applewhite's natal chart, we notice that he has a lot of Neptune aspects, including an extremely tight orb aspect of Neptune trining his midheaven at 0 degrees and 0 minutes. And he also has Neptune in a semi-square aspect with Jupiter, and that's also very close, 0 degrees and 30 minutes. Also, Applewhite's natal chart is remarkably similar to another cult leader who, in this case, didn't lead people to a mass suicide, but he did basically carry out something that's often referred to as the Jonestown Massacre, which was a mass poisoning of his cult followers. And because these guys' birthdays are only 4 days apart, they actually share a Jupiter conjunct Pluto aspect, the Jupiter semi-square Neptune that we talked about before, Jupiter square Uranus. And those are all because they're born close to each other, because their birthdays are close together, they would share those aspects. But they also both have Neptune aspecting their ascendant and midheaven, which is, even if you're born 4 days apart, you wouldn't necessarily share those aspects. So just a little overview of what Jonestown was. It was a settlement that he had created in Guyana for his cult members. I'm just going to quote here as well from Wikipedia. Jim Jones had a fascination with Joseph Stalin, Karl Marx, Mao Zedong, Mahatma Gandhi, and Adolf Hitler from a young age. It is believed to be the reasoning for the obsession with wanting to create a total control society. So again, we talked before about mass psychosis and mass mind control and how that relates to Jupiter, Neptune, and we see it here as well. Jonestown became internationally known when, on November 18, 1978, a total of 909 people died at the settlement at the nearby airstrip in Port Kaituma and at a temple-run building in Georgetown, Guyana's capital city. The name of the settlement became synonymous with the incidents at those locations. In total, 918 individuals died in Jonestown, all but 2 from apparent cyanide poisoning. The planet Neptune also relates to poisoning. I don't think I included that on my slide where I talked about their different symbolisms, but it does relate to poison in addition to all medications and all drugs, whether they're pharmaceutical or street drugs, because they alter our reality. And anyway, from cyanide poisoning, a significant number of whom were injected against their will in an event termed revolutionary suicide by Jones and some People's Temple members on an audio tape of the event and in prior recorded discussions. So you're probably wondering why in the world would he have done this beyond just being, batshit crazy. But there was a politician, California Representative Leo Ryan, arrived on a one-man investigative mission, bringing along a TV camera crew and various reporters. 15 church members asked to leave with him. So he showed up to this cult community, this complex that he had created in Guyana, and people wanted to leave. They were over it at this point. And basically, Jim Jones felt threatened by that. So he sent gunmen to a nearby airstrip where they killed Ryan, an NBC correspondent and his cameraman, a newspaper photographer, and one of the departing family members. So, as we can see, there are a lot of pretty sinister effects that can come of a Jupiter-Neptune cycle. But I want to leave this on a positive note because, not all of us in the world are operating low vibrationally. I mean, we all do sometimes, but I think most of us definitely see the need to really grasp for something higher and for something better, for a better world, and to be visionaries and co-creators of that better world. So with that said, let's leave on a high note. Let's leave on a positive note and think about the fact that if we choose to take advantage of this new Jupiter-Neptune cycle and use its high vibrational qualities to best effect, we can create a better world. We can bring about a world of greater peace. I mean, we have to be realistic and not let our idealism get the best of us, which is something that can happen with this cycle. But if we can believe that a better world is possible, we can create it.